We're going to talk about what happened in Xiamen. All's well that ends well, they say. That appeared to be the sense as Prime Minister Narendra Modi left the Chinese city of Xiamen after attending the BRICS summit and spending over an hour during a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping. The first positive, as we see it, both sides had moved on from the Doklam standoff. Listen in.
A healthy and stable China-India relationship serves the interest of the people of our both countries. It is also the shared expectation of our region and international community. China is prepared to work with India to seek guidance from Panchsheel to increase political trust, advance mutually beneficial cooperation and promote the further development of China-India relations along the correct path.
And here's a look at the other positives. It is natural for neighbours to have differences, and these differences should not be allowed to become disputes, is what both sides seem to be saying. India-China relations are a factor of stability. Listen in to more reactions.
Both of us know what happened. Okay, so this was not a backwards-looking conversation. This was a forward-looking conversation. The sense of it was, how do we take the relationship forward? How do we ensure that there is peace and tranquility on the border areas to ensure that the relationship stays forward? How do we ensure that mutual contacts and mutual trust is strengthened so that peace and tranquility on the border areas? So that was the direction in which the conversation. An area of difference, it should be handled with mutual respect, and effort should be made to find common ground in addressing those areas. And specifically with regard to defense, that the personnel involved with defense and security must maintain strong contacts and cooperation and ensure that the sort of situations which happened recently do not recur.
Jaishankar did not say whether the two armies would resume their annual hand-in-hand exercise, which is due to be held in November in India. Normally, the two sides discuss the elements of the drill at least 3 months in advance. But because of Doklam, that did not happen this time. Since the BRICS declaration came out with a strong reference to terror groups, it's not clear if Modi raised the issue of Pakistan or China blocking India's move to sanction Masood Azhar of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, or for that matter, the disputed border. Nor is it clear if there was any breakthrough on China's continuing refusal to entertain India's admission into the nuclear suppliers group. Presumably, that is work in progress. The positive vibes do not mean Hindi Chini bhai bhai, not just yet. Bilateral differences are way too many. China's strategic direction and its choice of Pakistan as a close ally make tensions, strains and uncertainties par for the course. And joining us this evening on Gravitas, with me in the studio, Ambassador Arun Singh, former ambassador to the United States, and Ramesh Ramachandran, who's been bringing us the latest updates all the way from Xiamen in China. Good evening to both of you. Ambassador Singh, what according to you was the biggest or the big takeaway from this visit and from today's bilateral meeting?
So if we look at specifically today's bilateral meeting, I think there were many positives. If you just saw the optics of the encounter, of course, some people commented that there were no hugs, but you saw that there was a very warm handshake, an extended handshake and repeated handshake. And I think both leaders were signaling to the media and to the world that they're making an attempt to move forward in the relationship. In the visual that came out in the public domain from the meeting itself, you can see President Xi saying that he believes that a stable India-China relations are good for both countries, and that the two countries were major neighbors and the two are the largest emerging countries in the world. So there was a signal of recognition of India's importance, signal of looking at India as an equal of China. And from the perspective that China very often looks at issues in hierarchical terms, I think it was an important message at this point of time, trying to take the process forward after Doklam. In terms of the briefing that the Foreign Secretary did after the meeting, he spoke about the talks being forward-looking and constructive, that peace and tranquility on the border was a prerequisite for improvement of relations, and therefore making the point that both sides needed to work to avoid a situation like Doklam, that there was a need to strengthen mutual trust. They must address the differences with mutual respect, find common ground. The defense mechanisms in the two sides must maintain contact. The other mechanisms must be strengthened. So a clear message that the two countries recognize the importance of strengthening interactions, mechanisms going forward to do their best to avoid another situation like this. And again, I thought it was interesting in the briefing that the Foreign Secretary said that in the bilateral meeting, the subject of terrorism was not raised, and that was pursued more in the multilateral BRICS context. And it was significant because perhaps a clear decision was taken that on this particular issue of Pakistan's involvement with terrorism, perhaps further satisfaction from China was not possible at this stage, and therefore it was better not to raise it specifically in the bilateral context. But through the BRICS mechanism, when a very strong message was incorporated in this summit outcome on terrorism, it's part of the message to Pakistan and to China that there is a global norm against terrorism, something that they must factor in whatever decisions they make.
Sure. Ramesh, the Chinese government speaks as much through its diplomats as its media, if not more. How is the Chinese media looking at this visit by the Indian Prime Minister and especially today's meeting?
Well, from the Indian side, Palki, if you look at the Xi-Modi meeting, the emphasis was on security and especially Doklam. But if you talk to Chinese media and Chinese officials here in Xiamen, their emphasis or priority is on people-to-people ties, economy, trade investments, and cultural connect between India and China. So clearly, there is an asymmetry in expectations on both sides. Indians looking to move on from Doklam, learn the lessons, and move on to have a forward-looking agenda, as it were, to borrow a phrase used by Foreign Secretary Jaishankar. From the Chinese side, essentially, they're looking at trade and investments and keeping the relations on an even keel. And this meeting that happened today in Xiamen will set the course, set the pace for future interactions between India and China going forward. But that said, the concern is the implementation. Will the spirit of the Astana consensus survive the BRICS summit, or after the BRICS summit here in Xiamen? And the proof of the pudding will be the eating. And in the next couple of months, we'll see the UN Security Council take up the issue of Masood Azhar's proscription once again. And if China did signal its intent yesterday in the Xiamen Declaration, then the real test will come if it indeed decides to walk the talk, as it were, and actually go ahead and support India in proscribing Masood Azhar. So clearly, a lot of work to be done. It's a work in progress, but both sides are optimistic that the only way forward is to cooperate, not compete.
And that is what I was going to come to. What will life be like for the two sides after BRICS? We are saying that they've left Doklam behind, but what's to say that a similar issue will not flare up in the near future?
I think one can never predict that with 100% degree of confidence. The major factor is that there is an unresolved border between the two countries. We've had an agreement on peace and tranquility on the border in 1993, an agreement on confidence building measures in 1996. There are mechanisms to address differences that may arise or situations that arise. But that having been said, there is a certain amount of infrastructure construction happening on both sides. As Chinese economy and military strength increases, their presence not just in the border areas, but in other parts in the Indian Ocean, in countries in South Asia, is going to expand. And therefore, as two rising powers in Asia, it is inevitable that India and China will have to, from time to time, deal with situations where maturity and certain amount of diplomacy is required in taking that forward. So I think, at best, one can say that the situation at Doklam was resolved with maturity, diplomatically. Both sides have signaled they want to move ahead from there, but that doesn't mean that situations like this will not happen again.
Ramesh, not much has been said in the official statements, but through your sources, have you been able to gather if Pakistan was discussed? Interestingly, the Pakistan Foreign Office has put out a statement talking about terror groups, saying that it's as much concerned about terrorism in the region as anyone else. And it mentions the TTP, the JUA, the Daesh, the ETIM, the IMU, but very conveniently leaves out the groups that operate from its soil against India.
Well, clearly, neither Doklam nor the issue of terrorist groups operating on Pakistani soil came up in that bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. These twin issues were indeed discussed in the run-up to the BRICS summit, and it manifested itself in the Xiamen declaration. But that said, as I said before, the emphasis was on taking the relationship forward, not as much becoming a prisoner of the past, as it were. And by that I mean the Doklam standoff. Both sides wanted to draw the right lessons and move on from there and not look back in the rearview mirror more often than is necessary. So clearly, as the emphasis was on a forward-looking agenda, both sides want to move on to other issues going forward and to ensure that such incidents, if they do indeed happen again, there are enough mechanisms in place to redress those issues. And as Foreign Secretary Jaishankar mentioned in the press conference after the Modi-Xi meeting, he spoke about confidence-building measures of removing the strategic distrust, as it were, that exists between India and China. And also that in terms of mechanism, he suggested that border personnel meetings and border personnel should be meeting more frequently than before, so that such instances, if they do happen, are nipped in the bud and not allowed to snowball into a crisis. Remember, at the Astana consensus, at the Astana meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi, both has agreed not to allow the differences to become disputes. So I guess that spirit hopefully would survive even after the BRICS summit. But then, if the past is any indicator, Palki, one can never say never, and China can be expected to probe India along multiple locations, at multiple locations along the line of actual control, which spans almost 4,000 kilometers, or possibly in a third country like it happened in Doklam. So one cannot rule out the Chinese motivations going forward. But that said, China respects strength, respects power. So I guess Doklam did at multiple levels send the message across to Chinese policymakers in Beijing that thus far and no further. So clearly the Chinese may have learned their right lessons from Doklam, and one hopes that this would keep the bilateral ties on an even keel going forward as well.
Right. For a layperson, Ambassador Singh, the big issues that we care about, Pakistan, Masood Azhar, UNSC, NSG, were not brought up. Or if they were brought up, we don't know about it. As a diplomat, do you want to shed light on how it works in conferences, in summits like this? Are diplomatic niceties over and above the sticky issues that must be discussed? Are they brushed under the carpet? How does it work?
Well, sticky issues certainly are brought up, and you have to decide when is the best time to bring it up, and sometimes it's better to avoid them. Now, in the run-up to the BRICS summit, as you can see, the issue of terrorism was up front. Just before the summit, a spokesman from the Chinese Foreign Office indicated that perhaps India should not raise the issue of Pakistan's involvement with terrorism. But if you look at the summit document, there is very clear reference to terrorist groups that are operating from Pakistan. And therefore, that's not an issue that where India backed off and raised the issue. At one level, it became possible to incorporate this strong language because in the Heart of Asia conference in December last year, which was in Amritsar, where China, Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan were all present, this language had been brought in. So it was very difficult for them to walk back from that language. So India worked to have that incorporated in a BRICS document in a summit in China. And so it's significant. So even though Pakistan had agreed to similar language, coming out from a document in China was something that would have caused them some concern, and that's perhaps the reason why in Pakistan there has been a negative reaction. But one should not be surprised at Pakistan's reaction because they've always denied and they claim as if they are victims of terrorism, and there are certain terrorist groups that are attacking Pakistan. Pakistan and its agencies have been involved in supporting terrorism. So I think on all these issues, in the run-up to the summit, India's position was clearly explained. And perhaps a decision was taken, as the Foreign Secretary mentioned, that in the bilateral meeting itself, that particular issue was not specifically raised because the assessment may have been that what we needed to achieve, we have achieved. And we are not going to get anything further by raising it at this stage.